The Eye of the Cyclops. The Cyclops was certainly a terrifying creature. It was about the height of a two-story house with thick curly hair, a matted and usually filthy beard, and only one eye set square in the middle of its forehead. It was grotesquely ugly, extremely bad-tempered, inordinately violent, and generally worth going a long way to avoid. All these, any good book on Greek myths will tell you, but what is less often mentioned is the fact that the Cyclops was also incredibly stupid. It was probably one of the most stupid monsters that ever lived. There were a great many Cyclops. At one time, they had been employed as blacksmiths for Zeus, but after a while they had forgotten not only how to do the work, but what the work was that they were supposed to do, and had become shepherds instead. They were shepherds for almost 200 years before it occurred to them to go and buy some sheep. Then they took their sheep and settled on an island in the middle of the Aegean Sea where they lived in caves, seldom, if ever, talking to one another. There were two reasons for this. The first was that the Cyclops were poor conversationalists, often forgetting the beginning of a sentence when they were only halfway through. But also, if there was one thing a Cyclops couldn't stand, it was another Cyclops. The most famous Cyclops was called Polyphemus. He was a son of Poseidon, the god of the sea, but preferred very much to stay on land, looking after a flock of sheep. Polyphemus had no friends but was on intimate terms with most of the sheep. He knew them all by name, chatted to them, milked them as gently as his huge fingers could manage, and shed real tears whenever he had to slaughter one in order to make his particularly delicious lamb stew. One day, returning to his cave after a hard day's work in the hills, he was astonished to find that he had visitors. They were still there, in fact, sitting in front of his fire and feasting on one of his sheep. There were about a dozen of them, and looking more closely, he was delighted to see that they were human beings. Polyphemus loved human beings in his own way, which was cooked or raw. What he particularly liked about them was the way their bones crunched between his teeth, but never got caught in his throat. The giant's face lit up in a great smile. It was also a horrible smile, for having just one eye in the middle of his forehead, everything he did with his face was rather horrible. "Who are you?" he demanded. The men had by now huddled together and were looking at him with a mixture of horror and terror. Then one of them stepped forward. "Good monster," he said, "we are Greeks. We are returning home, having fought a great war at Troy. We stopped here to find fresh provisions for our ship and thought to pass the night in your cave." Polyphemus scowled. He had never heard of Troy and didn't particularly like being addressed as a monster. The man bowed low. "I'm sure you need no reminding," he said, "of the laws of Zeus, which demand hospitality to poor travelers such as ourselves. And But he was wasting his time. Polyphemus didn't even want to know what hospitality meant. Moreover, he was hungry. His mouth had been watering from the moment he had seen the human beings. Now, brushing the man aside, he grabbed two of his companions by their feet, dashed their brains out of the stone floor, and tossed them into his mouth. Crunch, crunch. He shivered with pleasure as they slid down his throat. 2 men from 12 left 9, or was it 11? And if he had 2 more for breakfast and 2 more for dinner every day, they would last him until... But the mathematical sum was too difficult for him. Rolling a huge stone in front of the cave's exit, he fell into a contented sleep. He would have slept less well if he had known just who the men in the cave were. They were, as their leaders had said, Greek warriors returning home from the 10 long years of war that had raged around the city of Troy, and which had only ended with the famous trick of the Trojan horse. Their leader was called Odysseus, and he was to become one of the most celebrated of the Greek heroes. He was a king, the king of Ithaca. It was Odysseus who claimed the credit for the inventions of the wooden horse, although it had in fact been the idea of Athene, the god of wisdom. But it was certainly true that Odysseus had been one of the men who had hidden inside the horse, and he had fought most valiantly in the sack of Troy. And whether he invented the wooden horse or not, he was well known for his cunning and trickery. There seemed little he could do in his present predicament, however. The stone that Polyphemus had rolled across the entrance to the cave was far too big to move, and it fitted exactly without any cracks to slip through. The following morning, when the giant woke up, he could only watch helplessly as 2 more of his men were seized and devoured. Then the giant left, herding his sheep in front of him, and at last Odysseus was able to set his mind to work. It was often cold on the island, and Polyphemus kept a plentiful supply of wood for his fire. Each log was the size of a small tree indeed. That's just what many of them were, for the Cyclops often plucked up a whole tree and carried them home. Odysseus ordered his men to draw their swords, and together they began hacking at one of the logs. It took them hours, but by the time evening arrived, they had removed all the branches, cut the tip to a needle-sharp point, and hidden the whole thing in the back of the cave. Then the stone rolled aside. The sheep came in, and behind them Polyphemus. 2 more of the unfortunate travelers found themselves lifted in the air, screamed as their skulls were cracked, and disappeared into the giant's mouth. But this time, before Polyphemus could fall asleep, Odysseus approached him. "Sweet monster," he cried, "I hope you have enjoyed my 2 friends." "They were a bit chewy," Polyphemus replied. "That was probably their armor. But I was wondering, dear giant, if you would care to quench your thirst with some wine after your delicious supper." "What's wine?" the Cyclops asked. "It's a drink made from grapes, O mighty one," explained Odysseus. "By chance, I have 2 barrels with me here. Please be my guest." He gestured toward the barrel which held enough wine for 20 men. Polyphemus snatched it up and downed the whole lot in one mouthful. "It's good," he exclaimed. "Do you have more?" "1 more barrel, your greatness," Odysseus said. "Give it to me." "With pleasure." Polyphemus grabbed the 2nd barrel and drank that one down too. But the wine was very strong, and as the giant had never had alcohol before, it had an immediate effect on him. He became drunk. "What's your name?" he asked. I beg your pardon, Odysseus said. Your name? What's your name? It's Odysseus, Odysseus told him. This being the Greek word for nobody. Nobody, Polyphemus repeated. Well, nobody is my friend. And because he's my friend, I'll eat nobody last of all. I'll eat all the others first, then nobody after. And with that, Polyphemus fell into a drunken slumber. At once, Odysseus and his remaining comrades lifted up the log they had prepared and thrust the point into the fire. Soon, the tip was white hot and crackling. The noise might have woken Polyphemus up, but because of the wine, he was in a deep sleep and didn't even stir when Odysseus climbed onto his chest. But he woke up and screamed the place down when the sixth man drove the burning stake right into his eye, turning it round and leaving it jutting out of his forehead. The Greek warriors raced to the back of the cave as he leapt up and down, bellowing so loudly that the walls shook and dust cascaded down. The noise was so great that several other Cyclops gathered round the mouth of the cave and demanded to know what was the matter. I am blinded and in ghastly pain, Polyphemus moaned. How did it happen? One of the Cyclops called out. It was nobody's fault, Polyphemus explained. You mean it was an accident? No, nobody did it to me. I blame nobody, and I'm going to kill nobody on account of it. The Cyclops looked at one another and scratched their heads. If nobody's done anything, they said at last, you must be having a bad dream. Why don't you go back to sleep and leave us in peace? With that, they turned their backs on the cave and went back to bed. The next morning found Polyphemus in a miserable state. There were no Greek soldiers for breakfast that day. He couldn't even manage a piece of toast or boiled sheep. Everything was dark for him, and he had a blinding headache. Nonetheless, he rolled the stone aside to let his flock out to pasture, taking great care to fill each animal with his hands in case any of the men tried to escape. But this was what Odysseus had been waiting for. During the course of the night, he had tied some of the sheep together, using their own long wool to do it. Then, in exactly the same way, he had tied his surviving friends underneath them so that they hung just above the ground. And although the blind giant ran his hand along the back of the sheep, he didn't think to feel underneath, so that way the Greeks were able to escape. Odysseus was the last to leave, but he had chosen the largest sheep for himself, not knowing it was the giant's favorite. And to his dismay, he found himself stopped as the sheep reached the mouth of the cave. My dear Penelope, Polyphemus sighed, addressing the sheep. Normally, you are the first to leave, but today you are the last. Could it be that you are upset because your master has been horribly hurt by nobody? Bah, Odysseus said. You run along then, Polyphemus muttered, and with Odysseus breathing a huge sigh of relief, he allowed the sheep to pass. The escaped prisoner reached their sheep and set sail as quickly as they could. As they left, Odysseus couldn't help laughing at the success of his plan, and Polyphemus, hearing him, hurled a massive stone in the direction of the sound, missing the ship by inches. Odysseus laughed again and called out to the giant, If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus. son of Laertes and king of Ithaca. And perhaps the next time strangers call, you'll remember the sacred laws of hospitality. But Polyphemus never showed anyone the slightest trace of hospitality. He spent the rest of his days sitting in the fields with his sheep, moaning to himself. And who can blame him? For it must be said that to lose one eye when you have two of them is a great misfortune. But you have only one to begin with, then it is nothing short of a catastrophe.